Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Mary Collins, and I'm the Director of the British Columbia Healthy Living Alliance. And we're really pleased to host this webinar today in partnership with the Real Estate Foundation of British Columbia. Thank you for joining us. I know we have many new attendees as well as some of those who attend our regular webinars. All great to have you online. Now, many of you may be familiar with the Real Estate Foundation and some of the great work they do, but for those of you who don't, the Real Estate Foundation is a philanthropic organization. They help to advance sustainable land use in British Columbia in two ways, by providing grants to nonprofit organizations and by conducting research and special projects. Today, our webinar, Building Communities to Motivate People to Walk and Bike, will look at some public opinion research that was part of a multi-phase study by the Real Estate Foundation on the state of built environment sustainability in British Columbia. We'll also have presentations on the types of facilities that motivate cycling and tools that can help smaller communities build support, plans, and facilities for active transportation. I'm going to tell you more about the program shortly, but just before we get rolling, just like to go over a few housekeeping items. First of all, if you're having trouble hearing me or the presenters, try turning up the volume on your phone or computer. And of course, we really want your input today, so we'll be asked to use the control panel on the right-hand corner of your screen. Type in your questions for our speakers as you think of them, and we'll have a question period after each speaker and a final round at the end of the three presentations. We also want you to participate in some polls. We'll give you a heads up that the poll is coming, and you'll see a blue screen that has multiple choice questions. Please respond to the polls. You'll have a few seconds to do so, and then we'll publish the results for everyone to see. And the polls provide us and the panelists and you with instant feedback. Again, we really want to hear your questions and comments, and you can submit them at any time during a presentation, simply typing them in the question box on the right-hand side of the screen. And please indicate if there's someone in particular you're addressing it to, and we'll certainly try to answer as many as we can have time for, and if we miss any of them, we'll send out a post-event email with the missed questions and answers, and we'll also be posting the webinar on the website over the next couple of days as well. So now let me tell you about our program today. Communities that make it more convenient and comfortable for people to walk and bike to where they need to go also make it easier for people to be healthier. Investment in active transportation infrastructure has been called a best buy for governments by the World Health Organization because the evidence shows it is one of the most effective ways to support physical activity rates and healthy weights. Both are key to the prevention of chronic disease. Healthy built environments that make the healthy choice the easy choice are contingent on good community planning, but also require political and public support. So today we're going to hear about some research and tools that can help build support for healthier communities. We're going to have three 15-minute presentations, and then we've left time for discussion at the end of each presentation, so we encourage you to make comments and ask questions. Now, just before we get started on the webinar presentation, we'd like to start with a question about you. Since we're talking about building healthier communities, let's find out about the type of community that you come from. So look at the poll, and you've got a couple of questions. Which of these best describes your community? A large urban center, a suburb, an exurb, which is outside a city beyond the suburbs, small town, or rural remote area. And well, it looks like 49% come from large urban centers and 24% from small towns. So that's a good sort of spread, and a few from some of the other areas as well. Well, let me now introduce our first speaker, Agnes McAllister. Angus has some insights to share about what matters to British Columbians when it comes to community planning. As mentioned earlier, his research was part of a multi-phase study by the Real Estate Foundation on the state of built environment sustainability in British Columbia. Angus is the founder and principal of McAllister Opinion Research. It specializes in the areas of market intelligence, public policy and communications and takes a particular interest in sustainability and environmental issues. Welcome, Angus, and we're looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Mary. I'm very pleased to be here and to share with you an overview of the findings of this study. And I do want to, again, acknowledge the support of the excellent staff of the Real Estate Foundation of BC and a company that also helped us in the planning of this project, which is Modus Planning. What's great about working with these organizations is that it's not just financial support, but there's a lot of intellectual support and improving your surveys. So they're not just your sort of a shallow survey, but it helps us develop research that delves beneath and looks below the surface. So in describing the work I'm going to talk about for the next 4 hours, was it? Or 15 minutes, right?
15 minutes, Alistair.
I first want to describe the research question. So basically, the question we were trying to answer, what the point of this study was, generally speaking, how do British Columbians think about sustainability in the built environment? And by the built environment, there's a long, complicated description of the built environment, but community works. There are communities they live in. And we basically wanted to look at how do they perceive the communities they live in right now, how satisfied are they, how do they feel about their quality of life subjectively. We wanted to look at their knowledge and understanding of the issues, and their preferences for future development, especially with regard to sustainability and some of the specific issues that communities, especially in British Columbia, are grappling with, not just in the Lower Mainland, but across the whole province. But within that analysis, or the research we did, we tried to understand, look at language in particular, and we did things called, which I'll get into a bit later, called A/B test, to look at the effect of language on questions, the answers to questions. We tried to do some a multivariate analysis to look at what drives opinions and views and satisfaction, which again I won't get too much into, but I'll touch on. And finally, and probably most importantly, we try to get a better understanding of the audiences and audience segments, the different particularities of the audiences. So the next question I want to just get to is, how do we do this survey? What was the methodology we used? And it's just, I'm going to cover it over really briefly. So, which I think it's the next slide along. So we did an online survey of 1,701 respondents across British Columbia, and this is the, I won't get into the detail, but if anyone wants details on the methodology of panel surveys, feel free to contact me after. This is what's called a gold seal, top of the line certified sample, which is basically drawn in different regions and designed to attempt to match the population of BC in terms of various demographics. The margin of error on the sample should approximate. It's not a true random sample, but when you actually test these samples, the results basically line up with all the other telephone and other surveys we've done. So I have a high level of confidence in the sample. The margin of error should be plus or minus 2.4%, 19 times out of 20 for the whole province. The other thing I should mention about this sample is that it's a very large sample. As you might know, when you hear people talk about surveys in a place like British Columbia, there are often 600 to 800 people in the survey. So 1,701, the one is not that important, but 1,701 people allows us to break up the sample and drill down a little bit into regions. So at the bottom of the slide, you have a sort of a summary of the different regions we covered, as well as the way we sort of described. So we've actually sampled people in all the towns we've mentioned below. So just move along. So the first question we asked was we wanted to gauge how people felt about, how British Columbians feel about their neighborhoods and communities. And so we asked a question on quality of life. And this is an important question because it helps us understand, it's almost an outcome question. We want to know how people feel, how the differences between different communities. What was interesting is across the province, we had a very, very high ratings on quality of life. So the question itself was, how would you rate overall quality of life in the following places? And we asked about community, neighborhood. People had a chance of a choice of excellent, good, okay, mediocre, or poor. We had 8 and 10 British Columbians saying excellent and good, which is a very, very high sort of rating. But what was interesting is that there were big differences within that sample. So Vancouver Islanders and people in small cities in the southern interior, for example, Kelowna, were significantly more likely to rate their quality of life in both their neighborhoods and their communities as very high relative to people in suburban Lower Mainland and some of the suburban areas of the capital region, otherwise known as Victoria. So there's, first of all, a big gap. So people on rural, small city Vancouver Island and southern, small cities, southern interior were much, much more likely, 10 to 20 points more likely to say that where they live was great or good or excellent. And the other really consistent and resonant difference which we saw throughout the survey was a gap between retirees and men in particular. We're talking people age 65 plus and younger Canadians or younger British Columbians. So British Columbians under the age of 45, and the gap increased once you got under 35 and down into the 20s. So basically, people who are older were far more positive about the quality of their life in their communities and their neighborhoods, and younger folks were far less positive. You really saw this with younger women. They're far more likely to be negative. They weren't saying terrible, but basically they were saying okay or mediocre, which is actually a fairly negative rating in this kind of study. Move to the next slide. This slide here drills down a little bit further. We wanted to find out about what people liked and didn't like about where they lived. This just helps us map out just a sense of how people perceive the features of the community. And on the right-hand side, you'll see I think it's fairly self-explanatory, a chart where the blue bars are about people who are very satisfied or satisfied. At the very top of the list, we have distance to shopping and commerce, natural and green space, and walking or cycling are the things that they are most satisfied with. Now, this alone doesn't tell you that these things matter. They're satisfied with these things. So just before we asked this question, we asked an open-ended question, and it told us a little bit more about what was salient and what might matter. And that question was, thinking of the features of the built environment in your neighborhood and community, what would you not want to see changed? So what do you not want to see changed? And right at the top of the list was nature and green space. That was at the top of the list. And when we did a little bit of regression analysis later on, we also found that nature and green space really drove satisfaction with nature and green space, drove sort of high ratings with quality of life. Now, next down, we found a difference between younger adults and what I will call retirees. So for older adults, it was access to shopping that made them really happy. With younger adults, it was walking and biking opportunities. So that would be active living opportunities or access to those features. So those are really important. Now, the other piece of this is that older adults were also, it's a bit of a difference, very satisfied with community social support. So these are amenities, so things that would include like spaces in that category, spaces to socialize and gather, closest to family and friends, culture and art spaces, whereas younger adults were not happy about these things at all. They were not satisfied with these items. Moving further along to the next slide, this slide kind of summarizes what we found further in terms of where we found dissatisfaction. And some of this comes from the previous chart I showed you, but the most resonant aspect of dissatisfaction we found in these communities was basically transportation infrastructure. And we got at that, again, through an open-ended question that preceded this, the question on satisfaction. So we had, my dog has just decided to start barking. I don't know why. Sorry about this. I hope you don't hear it. So in the open-ended question, we asked, again, what people were dissatisfied with, or what they would like to change about their communities. And the first thing that came up on that list was sprawl and overpopulation and traffic. So these are a sense of the troubles people had. Older adults really mentioned roads, whereas younger people tended to speak about public transit. A big difference again in that generational gap. Another thing that is sort of peripheral, but it relates to traffic, was noise levels. The noise levels was really big in urban and suburban environments, particularly among women. And it was interesting because it was highly correlated with unhappiness about traffic, which is not surprising, I suppose. But there's a whole sense of traffic is the cause of unhappiness, but not just because you can't get anywhere. In fact, a lot of the people who weren't happy with traffic reported very short trip times to where they were going. So it wasn't necessarily that it slowed them down. They just didn't like all the traffic. Move on to the next slide. We drilled down a little bit in this survey into how people travel to different locations. So we asked about mode of transport commonly used to get to work, to friends and family, to recreational places, and to shopping. And we found that this chart on the right summarizes the percentage of people in different types of community and different age groups who use that mode of transport commonly, not all the time and not exclusively. So what we found was that 1 in 2 British Columbians cycle or walk as a mode of transportation, and less than half ever use transit. But the big difference was it was evident in terms of community type. So urban areas were far more likely to have people who cycled or walk, at 60%, and whereas suburban and small city areas, it was less likely so, which is not surprising, I suppose. But the rural areas were more likely. But the big difference, again, was age. So young people under the age of 45 were very, very likely to 60% were basically said that they used cycling or walking as a mode of transport. So the definition of this was not just for entertainment or for recreation, but for as a mode of transport. And the contrast again is people who are retired age 65 plus were by far the least likely to use this mode of transport, but they were also the most likely to say they only drove. They never used transit and they never walked. In fact, it was 67% of men 65 plus and 56% of women, and that behavior started exactly at 65. It was already starting early in the early 60s, so we weren't only thinking of people 85 and over. Move on to the next slide. So a key question that we like to ask about is, how do we get at future preferences? And so for people in terms of their problems. And this slide actually covers a what we call a split sample test. So we asked people what would they like to see more of in their region of, no change or less of in their region of British Columbia. There was a bit of a preamble. But the secret to this question was that a quarter of the people got different random samples of people got different wording, different lists. And so if you look at energy, some people got energy efficiency. We'd like to see more or less, no change or less. So I think everybody got that. But then a quarter of the people also got green buildings, a quarter of the respondents got energy retrofits, a quarter of the respondents got carbon neutral buildings, and a quarter got regenerative design. These are not exactly the same, but they're highly related. And what this shows us is, look, 73%, 3/4 of British Columbians think energy efficiency is great. We want more. Green buildings, it drops. Energy retrofits, it drops. Carbon neutral buildings, it drops to half. Regenerative design, it's 1/3. So language here, if people use these types of languages, it's a big difference in uptake and engagement. We see the same thing with sustainable transportation, public transit, not a huge difference. Smart growth, people like that, but they weren't big on compact communities and they hated high density communities. Again, these were split samples, so people who got smart growth didn't necessarily see both the other two. They got one or the other. So it was fascinating to see the impact. Bike routes and cycling routes, there wasn't a huge difference in terms of receptivity, except that we noticed with older men, men 65 plus really didn't like cycling routes and they liked bike routes. cycling routes, we saw about a 15-point drop, and later on in the survey when we asked people who has, do each of the following sort of organizations have too much or not enough influence, we did the split test again, and older men again didn't like cycling routes. They thought people who pushed cycling routes had too much influence, but the people who got bike routes thought, oh, it's okay. So something about that word. Just watching my time here. So the last point there, roads and parking, urban sprawl. People don't like urban sprawl, but they want roads, bridges, and parking. Interesting. That contradiction is less evident among young people. It's much more evident among older people. Go to the next slide. You know what? Just based on time, I'm going to skip this slide and move on to the next one, if you don't mind. So one of the ways of getting at understanding solutions is to circle back to a question which is about concern. So if we want to understand how people think about solutions, we can look at a question which is about concern. It tells us a little bit about the way people approach their solutions, because often a solution is about the way we framed a problem. So if we frame a problem as climate change, we're going to see something differently than if we frame the problem as fitness. So this slide just shows you the top issues that British Columbians see as concerning them when it comes to climate change and sustainability of the built environment, sustainability of the built environment in your community. And this just simply says that the top issues here are affordability, water use, and climate change. I'm going to stop there and move on to the next slide, because what's really interesting about this is actually the split samples on this. So we know that those issues are big. It is surprising in some ways that climate change is big, because it's usually not that big. But what was even more interesting is the split sample results. So let's look at affordable housing. The gray bubble tells you the percentage of people who were concerned about affordable housing, and the blue bubble, 56%, the blue bubble tells you that cost of housing basically resulted in a 19-point increase in concern. So the people that got the word cost of housing, 75% were concerned. The people who got the phrase affordable housing were only 56% concerned. Look at the next one down, extreme weather versus climate change. Major difference in level of concern. If you talk about climate change, British Columbians are really concerned. Energy use, waste and pollution. So basically, this is probably self-evident as you go down. You can look at it later, but there were some really big differences in the way we talk about the problem that actually results in big differences in how people respond. And what we found was that among older adults, men 65 plus, if you say climate change, they got upset because they started debating whether it was real or not. Young people didn't. And what we found consistently throughout the research we've done is that older adults, the older you get, the more likely you are to vote, but the more likely you are to doubt that climate change is an issue or that it's settled even. The opposite applies to younger folks. Let's go to the last slide, which I think is my conclusion. So my parting notes at minute 18 are basically summarizing sort of what I've shown you and some of the conclusions that we've derived from the larger survey, which is that there's a strong alignment between many public concerns and sustainability issues. People see green space and nature, walking and biking, and infrastructure, local shopping as very precious community assets. They want those to stay the same. They don't want to lose those. And they really mean local shopping. And there's widespread concern about sprawl, affordability, and traffic commute times. That you'd think these would be issues that, that these are related. But what's interesting is the generational divide around solutions. So older suburban retirees are way less concerned about climate. They consistently prioritize more roads, parking, and single detached housing as a solution to these issues of sprawl and affordability and things they don't like. Whereas younger adults it's completely flipped. They talk about public transit, density, climate, and resource scarcity as a concern, and they also are really excited about things like the word bike superhighways came up in our report, or not a report, but our text. So ultimately, the point I want you to walk out of is that there's a huge generational shift moving along, and there's a sense of we, and that new we is about a new generation that's moving into the forefront and starting to define issues in a way that's really different from the generation that's voting right now. And ultimately, when we move forward, we have to understand how those two generations process language, because a lot of the language differences I discussed briefly here were generational, and each group processes language very differently, and here's a different problem, and therefore moves to a different solution. That's all. Thank you very much.
Great. Well, thank you, Angus. That was a great presentation, and just to remind our audience that we will be posting it on the website, so if you didn't get a chance to kind of go through it in detail, because there's just such a rich array of information there, and it's really interesting how different demographic groups respond to different issues. I guess it's not surprising, but it's great to have that kind of research. Now, I don't know if we have any questions. Please feel free to post your questions on the box, but one question is that your research seems to suggest there's still learning that needs to happen about planning healthier built environments. And do you have any advice for those of us that want to start these conversations given the difference in the demographics of how to go about starting those conversations?
The one point I would start with is that the word density is a trigger. And when some people hear the word density, they think high rises. And most people think high rises and they think Gotham City or Soviet slums or just alienating places, as opposed to density, which could be low rises or 5 to 6 or 8 stories high. And we found that when we describe density in terms of low rises or mixed commercial residential zones, my guess is that if we used images of that, we wouldn't have people jumping out of their seats with their fists.
Right, thanks. Sarah has asked if there's any plans to repeat the survey at a future date to be able to compare over a period of time.
I think that I think we will be, because it's I'm not sure what the timing is, but I can't speak for our research Real Estate Foundation, but this is a study that would probably benefit from that type of repetition. And I know that in some of the research I will be doing in the future, there'll be some of these questions I will be tracking because they're relevant to broader sustainability concerns that I track in my other research.
And Serge is wondering, going back to the slide on mode of transportation, is there a definition of what commonly used means?
To the extent that we talked about, I would say that it's not a long definition, but there's more context in the question, and the question talks about local. So it basically would mean, again, this is a read of the question, would mean that you don't use this once in a while, and we don't have a big long dictionary definition, but if yeah.
Yeah, we've got a few more questions here. We'll try to get through a few more. Certainly, is there a difference in terms of attitude among the demographics across different living places, especially small cities?
Yes, absolutely. I would love to have got to that. So basically, urban environments, people in sort of downtown Vancouver, well, at least last summer, it might be changing now, but were far more excited and sort of apt to look at living active transportation as a really positive thing, and suburban environments were quite negative about these. And then when we get to smaller cities, there was a very strong sort of sense of familiarity, and I would say even excitement about the notions of sustainability. So when the open-ended answers, where we get people riffing off of themes if they're in small cities. So Kelowna comes up again, not just places like Nelson or Smithers, but lots of small cities where people were really articulate about these things, and they spoke about cycling and walking in, I would say, as something that's sort of very central to what they do, why they moved there. You can walk forever, and so it was yeah, very.
And
very.
Lan is wondering if it's possible to get the original report. Is it available?
Yes, it is. It's available on the Real Estate Foundation of BC site, and it's I think it's about a 70-page PDF, so it's easy to get. And there's also a crosstabs there as well.
Okay. I think we've got time for just one more question, and Natalie asks a really interesting one about how do we go about making policy that will please everyone? We need to plan what is best for the future, But if older adults are more active in politics, then this will be a barrier to climate change solutions and high density and active transit. Good question,
Absolutely.
Natalie.
It's a great question. So my thinking when looking at the data I've got from other studies and also looking at some of the success of Bernie Sanders in the States, and even the federal Liberals, one of the differences, and when you actually engage young people, is that you actually offer them what I would call not just vague policies, but you actually give them what I call chicken. A lot of policies talk about what I'd say the pots. They give people very vague things, but there's no definite what's in it for me for young people. And we actually have to stop thinking of the campaign as just the people, the grumpy people we meet in the room all the time. I think if we actually spend more time and develop a theory of audience, understand young people, we might make them feel a little bit less cynical that all politics is just about older people. I think that's a real issue. And when they get into when they move into the conversation, they will and they do influence older people because the older people are related to them.
Yeah, good point. Just one final one here that Stephanie's asked about. Would there be merit in a future survey to include questions about air travel?
I love that. Yes, I'm actually thinking of, well, it's a separate survey on climate change that I'm really interested in looking at air travel, or you say footprint of different airlines as well. So not just, individuals and
great.
organizations, yes.
Good. Okay. And thanks, Leo, for your comments about how older people often want to be able to park right outside their doctor's and dentist's office, and that many retirees move to retirement communities which often have no walking or cycling infrastructure.
Yes.
So thank you, everyone, for your comments. Thank you, Angus. Great presentation. Let me move on now to our second presenter, Dr. Kay Teschke. And Kay is a professor in the School of Population and Public Health at the University of British Columbia. She initiated the Cycling in Cities program of research in 2004, and it investigates factors that encourage or discourage bicycling and transportation infrastructure associated with increased or decreased risks of cycling injuries. Kay, please go ahead.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much to BC Healthy Living Alliance for inviting me today. And I just wanted to start by saying that I'm one of the older Canadians. I'm 63, and I've been remarking on how many of my age group and older are the people we see out cycling around Vancouver these days. So I think if we build it and make it comfortable for everyone, we'll see a lot more interest by older people in walking and cycling. So today I am going to talk about evidence about route types and what motivates cycling and what is safer or less safe. So next slide. So the first thing to know is that in general Canadians don't cycle, and so it's not surprising some of the results that we just heard. Overall in Canada, the proportion of work trips by bike, which is the only Canada-wide data that we have, is 1.3% in the 2011 National Household Survey. We'll be very interested to see what comes through in the census this year. That's just slightly higher than the US. BC has the highest mode share of all the provinces at 2.1%. But you can see in this slide that it's much, much lower than many of the Northern European countries. We also have lower walking rates than these countries, but though our walking rates are about a half to two-thirds of the walking rates in these European countries. So we have room for growth in walking, but the room for growth in bicycling is huge, and so it's an opportunity waiting to be taken. Next slide. So what deters us? Well, we did a survey, which I'll be talking about other results of, in Metro Vancouver, and we found that route safety was the top deterrent. And you can see the kinds of things that were included in that: car, bus, and truck traffic, vehicles driving faster than 50 kilometers an hour, motorists who don't know how to drive safely near bikes, and the risk of injury from being in a collision with a car, which of course is has the most severe outcomes. Our results in this survey mimic results in surveys across North America. So this is not unique to Metro Vancouver. And so this is a huge problem, is route safety. Next slide. So we did 2 surveys, the one that I just talked about, which was of 1,400 people in Metro Vancouver. We asked about 73 potential motivators or deterrents, and so the deterrents you just saw came from that list. And we also asked about 16 different route types. And we did it differently than any previous survey. We showed people 3 pictures of each of the 16 route types. So we knew when people were ranking them that they were seeing the same thing and ranking the thing that we wanted them to rank. The other study we did, because of the importance of safety to choices to cycle, was an injury study. And that study was done in the City of Vancouver and the City of Toronto, mainly because those 2 cities have varied route types, and that was important to be able to understand the effect of route type on injury risk. There were almost 700 injured cyclists who took part in the study, and we evaluated 15 different route types in that analysis. And before I continue, I think this is a good place for a little survey question that I have for you.
Okay, if everyone can see the poll, if you could give us an answer, that would be great.
I tried answering this poll, but I guess I'm not allowed. Okay, I think, can you see the results, Kay? We're seeing definitely
them.
can see it. So an off-street bike path absolutely won the day. And then the interesting one is that the next one was a main street with physically separated bike lanes. So those are very concordant with the kinds of results we saw. So if we can go back to my slides, that'd be great. And so the next slide. So the one question that was really important to us was, in our 2 different studies, do preferences and safety agree? And you can see on the vertical axis is route preference, and you may not be able to see at the bottom of the horizontal axis, that is route safety. And you can see that the least preferred and the least safe were busy streets of various sorts, mainly without bike infrastructure or simply with painted bike infrastructure. And then on the other side, the most preferred and the most safe were bike-specific facilities, including separated bike lanes on major streets, bike-only paths, so the kinds of things that you guys just voted for. One of the surprising outcomes of our research is that multi-use paths were very preferred, but they were not turned out not to be as safe as we would like them to be. So what I'd like to do now, starting with the next slide, is start showing you some photos of different route types. And I'm going to divide it into 3 different sections. First of all, busy streets, then quiet streets, and then finally off-street. So in transportation parlance, arterials and collectors are what we call busy streets. And you can see we did vehicle counts and bike counts. These are not done in the transportation mode, which are usually per 24 hours. We just did it per hour. But you can see busy streets have lots and lots of motor vehicles every hour and many fewer bikes. Next slide. So busy streets with parked cars and no bike infrastructure at all turned out to be the least safe in our injury study and the greatest deterrent to cycling in our opinion survey. And this is hugely important because to get to our destinations, offices, shops, schools, we really need to travel along busy streets, at least for part of the time. And if this is what we offer, then it's no wonder that we don't have people cycling. And this is by far the most common kind of situation in our busy streets throughout Canada certainly British Columbia, and most of North America. So it's important to make a change. So the next slide. What if we add a little bit of infrastructure? Here we have painted bike symbols with 2 chevrons on top. This is called sharrows, meaning bikes and vehicles are supposed to share the lane. It turns out that they're not really any safer than without any infrastructure, and you can see this woman kind of hugging the parked cars, feeling vulnerable from the moving cars on her left, and definitely in the door zone. It's a little bit better in the inset where there's no parked cars, but this also is still a cycling deterrent. Next slide. What about now with a full-on painted bike lane and parked cars? So the bike lane is between the parked cars and the moving cars. This still does not particularly improve safety, and it still is a deterrent to cycling for most people. Next slide. So now, just by taking out the parked cars beside that bike lane, it makes a big difference to safety. Now the safety is improved about 40% compared to a similar street with no bike infrastructure and parked cars. Unfortunately, it has only a neutral impact on cycling, so it still does not make most people feel comfortable cycling. And you can see one of the problems with it. If you look straight up that bike lane, you can see that white car parked or stopped in the bike lane. Now the person in the bike lane needs to ride around it, and we still saw dooring events happen with painted bike lanes, even though there was no car parking allowed. Next slide. So, on a busy street with a fully physically separated bike lane, this turned out to be the safest infrastructure in our injury study. It reduced injury risk by about 90% compared to a similar street with parked cars and no bike infrastructure. So this is a huge improvement in safety. It also was the only busy street route type that actually encouraged people to cycle. And in Vancouver, we see a lot more women riding on this kind of infrastructure, and we also see children often riding by themselves. So that's a very big change to the kind of cycling that we see in our downtown streets. Next slide. Okay, now turning to quiet streets, which are mainly residential streets, and they're often termed local streets in transportation parlance. And here you can see a much reduced vehicle traffic on average and a very similar bike traffic on average. Next slide. So quiet streets make a big difference to safety. They reduce the injury risk by about 50%. But they had only a neutral impact on cycling, which is kind of disappointing. But one small change, which you can see in the next slide, is to designate it a bike route. Oh, previous slide? Yeah. It is to designate it a bike route. And when it's designated as a bike route in Vancouver, where this was observed, at the intersection with Busy Street, there is a cyclist-activated traffic light. So it allowed cyclists to cross the arterials on these bikeways. And that made the difference from just a neutral influence on cycling to motivating cycling. So a big improvement. Next slide. Quiet streets designated as bike routes with traffic diversion turned out to be the safest of this kind of street. So now you can see this traffic diverter at the intersection with a busy street that prevents at least some traffic from entering this street. This turned out to reduce injury risk by about 70% and a strong motivator for cycling. Next slide. There seems to be a lot of typing going on. I'm not sure if it... Oh, that's better. Quiet street traffic circles, unfortunately, turned out to be less safe. Traffic circles turned out to increase injury risk for 2 reasons. One is cars and bikes not knowing who had the right-of-way, and then all of a sudden making the same decision to proceed and crashing. The other was often a traffic circle acted as an obstacle for cyclists, and this meant that they might hit the curb or slide out if they made too abrupt a turn. Next slide. Okay, so then the last group is the off-street routes, including sidewalks, bike paths, and multi-use paths. We didn't count vehicles here because they're not supposed to be there, and you can see, again, very similar numbers of bikes per hour. Next slide. Sidewalks, we didn't ask about them in the opinion survey because sidewalk riding is not allowed in British Columbia, but we did, of course, include them in our injury study because people do ride on them, particularly where there isn't other infrastructure for bikes. It turns out that they were less safe, and it's quite interesting that this turned out to be true because it is something that has been found in other studies, and people have concluded that that means that riding on the road is safer than riding off-road. But sidewalks have particular characteristics that made them less safe, and we showed this in our study. One is lots of time, of course you're interacting with pedestrians, but there can be street furniture, posts, and also what you see in the inset here, which is sidewalk riders may arrive at the intersection in the direction opposite to expectation, so the opposite direction to traffic. And if you do arrive at the intersection in the opposite direction, it increases your risk of a collision at an intersection greatly, unless there is special treatment to warn drivers. Next slide. Multi-use paths, so they were very favored. They motivate cycling, but they turned out to be less safe, and it's really important that we figure out how to improve them because they are so popular. So for example, they have many of the same problems that sidewalks do: interaction with pedestrians, street furniture, posts, bollards, and you can see in the inset another feature. Often they're made to be interesting by planners, so they're made curvy, which is terrible. To have poor sight lines when two different modes of transportation with very different speeds need to interact is a bad design decision. The other thing is they often don't have traffic lights, or have, street lighting. So at night they often are very difficult to navigate. Next slide. So bike-only paths were the strongest cycling motivator, and we saw that in the answers that you gave to the question at the beginning. People love bike paths. It turned out that they reduced risk sort of 40 to 50%, which is less than we would have expected, and that's partly because many bike paths have similar problems to multi-use paths: no street lighting at night, bollards, poor sight lines, and so on. So it's super important to design them properly so that the motivation to use them jives with safety. And you can see in the inset here a well-designed bike path, very clear separation from pedestrians, great sight lines, no obstacles, and street lighting. So that's a great design. It really takes a lot of the design principles from road design and moves it to bike and walking paths. Next slide. So in our research, we have concluded that in the 3 different scenarios, there are very obvious choices for the best infrastructure, both to encourage cycling and to make cycling safer. First of all, on busy streets, physically separated bike lanes, also known as cycle tracks or sometimes as protected bike lanes, are the safest and absolutely encourage cycling. On quiet streets, bike routes with traffic signals at major intersections, traffic diversion to prevent traffic from crossing it and entering those quiet streets, that's the best choice. And then off-street, well-designed, bike-only paths. And next slide, which I think is the last slide. Oh, no. So I wanted to just finish with this quote from a fellow who's a journalist for the Calgary Herald, Tom Babin. He also wrote one of my favorite books on bicycling called Frostbike. Highly recommend it. He went to a winter cycling conference in Oulu in Finland a few years ago and also visited Copenhagen. He is a total road warrior, fearless cyclist in Calgary. And so he commented on how easy it was to cycle on cycle tracks, but then he said, but something else was also different. It took me a while to figure out what, but I eventually realized that I had relaxed. Unlike Calgary, I wasn't on constant lookout for cars getting too close for comfort. I could feel the difference in my gut. And to me, if a road warrior can feel that difference in comfort, can you imagine how much difference it makes to the average person, to women, older people, children, parents, to be able to have facilities that really feel like you are protected and comfortable. Next slide. I think this is, yeah. So I just wanted to finish and say that if you want to find our research, you can Google Cycling in Cities, UBC, and if any of you are interested, I do have a Twitter account and I mainly tweet about cycling.
Great. Thank you so much, Kay. That's really great advice, and particularly I think at the moment where there's a great deal of controversy, certainly in Vancouver and Victoria, about the development of bike lanes, mostly on busy streets. Very helpful. Time for a couple of questions. We may not get through them all, but we'll certainly respond to those later. But just a first question, Kay, do you have any good resources or checklists on what makes a good design for a multi-use path?
Can't say I have a checklist, but if you were talking to a planner, for example, or an engineer who is designing them, I would say, think about city streets. Would you make a city street curvy? Would you design it without street lights? Would you design it with bollards in the middle of the street? So that's perhaps the best guidance. You can look at our site. We have some information, and if you need guidance, I can perhaps, you could correspond by email and I'll get back to you.
Right. And someone has asked whether you've got resources for rural communities.
Right. So yes, rural is a big issue, but what I would say is it's something I've been hammering away at without my own study results, but what I can say is our survey did ask about this, and again, riding on rural roads without shoulders or even with shoulders is not something that appeals to people. It's also extraordinarily dangerous. You may have heard in Kalamazoo just a week or two ago, 5 cyclists were killed on a rural road. They were riding in a peloton of 10. The other 5 were injured badly, and this kind of disaster happens regularly. We had a similar thing happen in Pemberton about a year ago. We need to start building separated bike lanes along highways or completely separate in along different routes. That's what they do in Germany, Netherlands, Denmark. And in Quebec, they have a wonderful system of separate bike routes. So we have not even started in that vein. We absolutely need it. And I highly recommend it. Wide paved shoulders does not do the trick. It's better than no paved shoulders, but it doesn't do the trick.
Yeah. Caitlin had asked, she said maybe you missed it, but how do we make family cycling safer, particularly in Vancouver? The designated bike lanes are often not inclusive, e.g. cyclists go too fast for young children. And the only way to bike with young children often is for the parent to be on the road and the child on the sidewalk. Is that still safe?
Right. So certainly children are allowed to ride on the sidewalk, and going slowly, I don't see a problem. The main thing is to be alert at the intersections. If for some reason you're going in the wrong direction, I advise you not to. I think that there will be slowly but surely a change in culture on the designated bike routes and the separated bike lanes. There's no question that people who have cycled in British Columbia without any of this infrastructure are used to going fast. They're trying to meet the speed of automobiles, and they've been sometimes successful. But as we start growing the number of people who ride, the average speed of cycling is definitely going to go down, and that's true in Denmark and Netherlands. The average cycling speed is lower, and that's because more people cycle, and that's the same as traffic in big cities. It's actually on the average lower, just simply because of the number of vehicles. So we need to face that, and we need to accept it and welcome it, in fact, because it's safer to ride slower and it's more welcoming to all people.
And Stephanie has asked that for painted lanes, did you look at the difference between roads where parking is at the curb versus parking between the bike lane and the moving traffic? And her comment is, it seems crazy to me to have a painted bike lane that protects parked cars.
Yes, I agree completely. So it is true that now in Vancouver and many other cities around the world, there's a bit of a move to putting the bike lane between the parked cars and the sidewalk. That would be called a separated bike lane, because now you've got a physical separation of the parked cars. And that is a much better alternative. It will change who will be willing to cycle, and it definitely will make cycling safer. So it's a great choice, and yeah.
I don't think we'll get a chance to get through all the questions, but just the last one I'll combine two, because Bruce had asked whether you'd presented this to the Union of BC Municipalities, and Mike had asked, have you connected with the Ministry of Transportation and Highways regarding this area of work?
So I have never been invited to the Union of BC Municipalities, and I certainly would welcome that. If anyone would like to invite me, I would love to come. I have spoken to many municipalities, both in the Lower Mainland and elsewhere in BC and Canada, but not, of course, I haven't had the reach of every municipalities. And at first it would surprise me when people hadn't heard my results, but now I realize that they have to be repeated again and again to get the message out. The Ministry of Highways, I did participate in a number of the different requests for information and for of highways. So when they were doing the transportation plan for BC, I wrote about some of the things I just mentioned for rural roads, and I don't think I had much impact. My own impression is the Ministry of Transportation is still struggling to incorporate cycling into its views, and yeah, but it is slowly changing. There have been some improvements, but it's got a long way to go.
Well, hopefully with the work that you've done, and I know the work that many of those on the line are doing, this will have some positive results. So thank you so much, Kay. That's a great presentation. Yeah, I'd like to now move to our final presenter, Janet Rierich from the BC Recreation and Parks Association. Janet is the Professional Development and Initiatives Manager, and she has a master's degree in education and has worked in the recreation and health promotion sector for over 15 years and is herself an avid commuter cyclist. Janet, over to you.
Thanks, Mary, and thanks for inviting us to participate on this webinar. I'm going to share some information today about our BEAT initiative, which is an acronym for the Built Environment and Active Transportation. And before we begin, just to make sure everybody's awake out there, I've got a quick polling question for everyone. There's two questions here. First one is, do you personally use active transportation daily to get to work? So this would include either walking or cycling.
Okay, if folks can answer that one.
Yep, those are great numbers, and they do seem to follow much more of Angus's survey in BC. And just to reiterate Kay's numbers, the National Household Survey in 2011 their stat across Canada was 1.3% cycle to work and 5.7% walk. So we're definitely more active out here on the Wet Coast. And then there's one more question. So for those of you that have children, do your children use active transportation to get to school? Again, seems like we're better off in BC. Participation just last week released their national survey on physical activity, and again, the cross Canada statistic is that only 25% of children aged 5 to 17 walk or bike to school. So we can flip to the next slide. I'll just give you a bit of an overview of the BEAT initiative. BEAT was one of 4 initiatives that were part of the physical activity strategy that occurred in the pre-Olympic years. The BEAT was funded by BCHLA and administered by BCRPA in partnership with UBCM. We do still have the website up, and I've got a number of hyperlinks throughout this webinar so that if you want to come back and cross-reference things once the information is circulated to folks, it will be available for everyone to access. So BEAT had 3 main components. I think the overall goal really was to try to support communities to either amend or create plans and to better position local governments to apply for other grants. So there were dollars that were provided to communities to help in the planning piece. There was also development of a number of resources, and as well we had capacity to support communities to make it all happen, and that occurred via a staff person at BCRPA, and there were also a series of one-day summits that happened throughout the province. With respect to the community planning grants, just to give you a sense of how many and how much was handed out there, grants themselves varied from $15,000 to $25,000 and touched 39 communities across BC. The majority of the dollars were used to create or update community active transportation plans, while another 71% were specifically related to improving active transportation. In terms of the resource development, they're on the physical activity site. There is a final report on BEAT if you're interested in looking at more of the details. There are also a number of sample active transportation plans that were completed, so those are still hosted on the site if you're interested in coming back to that. And I will share some more success stories of these initiatives a little bit later in the webinar. In terms of resources, one of the pieces that was developed was a document called The Path to Health. And there was, what's interesting about this one is it provides arguments for anyone to use around the benefits of active transportation in a number of areas. So for example, it outlined health and social benefits, economic and environmental benefits as an example. And there are more updated stats for sure in terms of numbers, but the language around some of the benefits are still applicable today. So for example, if you see in the inset there, it talked about a research program at UBC that found that cyclists prefer lanes separated from traffic, which is exactly what Kay had just spoken to in terms of some of the statistics that we know that are more recent. So I believe the language that is in that document is still relevant in terms of folks making an argument today. Another resource is the neighborhood assessment tool, and this tool is actually still used quite actively today and is referenced in the Federal Transport Canada Guide to Active Transportation as a resource. The tool basically has you take a 1 square kilometer of area and you go through and assess all the areas related to active transportation. And you can see on the left it covers not only pedestrian and cycling infrastructure, but also assesses areas like land use, safety, and transit. The next screenshot here is of one of the pages, just to give you an idea of how the tool works. In this case, we're looking at assessing cycling infrastructure, and it asks questions like, are there any dedicated lanes or bicycle priority streets? You then give it a score. 1 is for no, 2 is for some dedicated lanes present, and 3 is for yes. And then what you do, if we flip to the next screen, is across each assessment, you put your score in there, and then on the bottom right you can see the red beautiful little circle, and it gives you, for those of you that are a bit more visual, gives you a really clear indication of where you might want to spend some of your efforts. The rest of the document really is a tool for planning what your priorities are and next steps. So it's a great first piece to just walk around your neighborhood and really analyze what's going on locally. On our website, there are a number of additional resources, and some of them are available from other organizations. And as I said, we will link to them in the webinar, so you'll be able to click through and find them again. Just going to flip through to the next one. Again, just a couple of other interesting documents that we have on there. Many of them are still quite active, and just a quick resource there for you. What I'd really like to do now is share some of the success stories. We had an opportunity to follow up with some of the organizations involved in BEAT and to see where they're at today and find out where their plans are, if they were collecting dust on a shelf or if they had a life of their own. Overall, it seems that most communities have implemented some of their actions, maybe long-term, so they weren't able to get them all accomplished, but they're definitely on the path, and many of them have actually incorporated the information that was created in this initial initiative into their overall community plans. Qualicum Beach is one example. After they completed their cycling plan, they were successful in accessing $100,000 from a local motion grant in 2009 to develop a trail that was identified in their plan as their top priority. They've also recently received an additional $100,000 cycling infrastructure grant to carry on with more cycling infrastructure work, and that work is beginning this summer. So we were excited to see that happen, because one of the goals of the BEAT initiative was, the hope was that once there was a plan in place, it would enable local communities to leverage additional funding, and it seems to be that that is carrying on. Another success story is in Invermere, and they were also able to access additional funding to support the work that they identified in their plan. They had 2 subsequent grants in the amount of $199,000 and $142,000, and they each paid for a portion of overall project costs. So far, they've been able to complete 3 of the 16 action items that they initially identified. So for example, they've upgraded several kilometers of existing trails, as well as added almost 4 kilometers of new trails in their communities. The photos above show some of the different path styles that Kay has identified. So they have a separated pathway from a road. You can see an extension from a pathway over a road with some painted crossing lines, and an extension of a roadway providing shared access on a quiet residential street. Ladysmith has also created a bicycle plan that saw some initial project funding to help complete some of their priority areas, but their biggest success is that their plan is actively used by the town staff today, every day. So anytime someone has a new subdivision application for road frontage improvements, the plan is referenced and the recommendations are made to the approving officer so that that information gets relayed back to the developers. The last success story I want to share is with New Westminster. They're the only one in that initial project that did a wheelability assessment, and their specific goal was to increase active transportation options for those specifically reliant on mobility aids such as wheelchairs and scooters. So they believe the greatest outcome of that project was that both council and staff became aware of the issues for those that require mobility aids. And then both council and staff, advocated for future budgets to increase funding. And essentially what's happened is their Internal departmental budget for sidewalk enhancements, upgrades and replacements, for example, had increased from $75,000 in 2010 to $150,000 in subsequent years. Next slide, this is just a real quick one of some other highlights. Again, people were able to get budgets approved. City of Rosslyn, the local government, so they would match any other grants that they were able to access. And Armstrong, again, is an example that they just have incorporated everything into their official community plan. And many other communities have found the same has happened locally to them. So we feel quite pleased after going back and just checking in, because we always hope that these are going to be the outcomes, is that once we mobilize people and have them put something into writing, that they will make things happen locally and that there's sustainability, and that certainly seems to be the case with this initiative. What I wanted to share with you as well today are some of the newer pieces that we have at BCRPA that are related to active transportation. The first is our Healthy in Nature online portal, and you'll see the site thanks. The site provides a number of primary and secondary research articles and papers related to the theme of and the benefits of being in nature. There are 5 categories, if you can see them on the left there. Research and benefits, public planning, programming, and quick reference guides. Each main category has a number of subcategories, and you can see from this example that under public planning there's a section called Built Environment, and on the far right you'll see a close-up of some of the articles listed in this area. And what's unique about this website is you can contribute articles yourself and subscribe to a certain topic area. And once you subscribe, you receive an email anytime a new article under that particular category area is uploaded. And I wanted to share these with you just because I love them so much. These are some of the promotional tools that we have available to encourage people just to get outside. They are available for download. You can print them off as posters. There are event posters and social media banners as well. And lastly, we also have our online collaboration site. It was designed with the primary goal of creating a space for everyone to have discussions online. And we're happy to start one there on active transportation if folks are interested in that. But we do have a number of articles related to active transportation on this site. So you can see on the search result above, I just typed in the word active transportation, and it basically links to any article on the website that has that in either the title or in the content of the document. On the main landing page, there are 6 sections you can look at specifically, and there's a discussion board, a section on research and reports, best practices, policies, grants, and related organizations. And that is the quick update from BCRPA on the BEAD initiative.
Thank you so much, Janet. Great resources, and I guess from our point of view at BCHLA, it's so wonderful to see that that seed money for many of the BEAD projects has really resonated and resulted in some long-term activities and improvements. I know I had the chance to visit the town of Qualicum and see what they'd actually been able to do as a result of that small amount of funding to help them develop their active transportation plan. So that's great. So we've got some questions for you. Sarah wanted to talk about, we appreciated the examples you provided, particularly for more rural and smaller communities. But one challenge we continue to see is the amount of matching funding available from senior levels of government for active transportation infrastructure. While there are indeed a few funding streams, the amount of money is significantly smaller compared to investments for driving, e.g. $100,000 for a bike path and $100 million for an interchange. Any suggestions of how we can move this?
Well, I would argue we all need to be advocating government for more money. I think Kay's got some great statistics to prove that bike lanes work. HASTE and the various other cycling organizations across the province all have the same information. I think, you know, we could all play a role in advocating government for more funding in this area. We know that it works when it happens. It's much more popular in Europe because they've made investments there and people are on board. So I think BC is a great example, right? If you just look at our statistics in terms of the number of people here that use active transportation to get to work compared to other jurisdictions across the country, I mean, we are doing something right here. It's still not probably as high as we would love it to be, but I think there's lots of things going on in BC that are great, but more advocacy on our end is never a bad thing.
And then another question of the tools that you've shown us today, and it's great to see all of the different materials that are available, but how do you think that smaller communities that weren't necessarily part of the B program and don't necessarily have planning capacity get the most out of them?
Well, I think we have many of those transportation plans from the smaller communities on the BEAT website, so I would suggest picking some ideas from there and communicating with those communities. They are all, at least most of the folks that I chatted with, are still using the documents that they created, 5-6 years ago, actively and on a regular basis. So some of them have been able to get council on board. I think that's been a really key element, in particular for New West. That's been a big key to their success, and they've been able to get council to lobby on their behalf for more funding as well. So
when it was murder, when Abby was outside, I'm trying to present, and she was barking outside. When you put, it was so horrible. Everyone was like, hundreds of people.
Leo's made a number of comments here. Thank you, Leo. His most recent one is not just funding. We need a change in policy and ask the government to implement an active transportation policy system-wide. So I think that's kind of what you're also reiterating, Janet, and others have said as well.
Well, and it's an election year, so I think the time is right.
Yeah, and that's certainly something that the BC Healthy Living Alliance that we're involved in and will be promoting as well. And we're going to be at UBCM, and so we'll hopefully see some of you folks and your elected officials there as well. I've got a few other questions. Perhaps I think all of our panelists are online, and hopefully I can point to them. Sarah had asked that, I think this is probably Kay to you, that you'd indicated that the top deterrents for cycling were route safety. What are some of the other categories of deterrents you found?
The other one that has a big influence is weather, and it's surprising in BC that it wasn't rain that was such a big deterrent, although it is a little bit of a deterrent, but much more ice and snow. So people are much less likely to ride when it's icy and snowy, and it's one of the reasons I loved Tom Bavin's book, Frost Bike, because it really shows that there are places that handle that problem quite well, but that's the other big one.
And that's certainly important for our northern communities to be able to
definitely
have that kind of support and advice, yeah. Sandra had asked, active travel is part of transit. Is this factored in the surveys? I guess that would be either to you, Angus, or Kay.
It's not in our survey, so Angus?
No, not in my survey either. Active, right, got it. No.
Oh, and Kay, Michael made the comment that I also understand that bike theft can be a deterrent to cycling too. Have you come across that?
Yes, I mean that was one of the things on our survey, but it just wasn't a strong deterrent. So if anyone wants to see the full list of the 73 factors that we looked at in our survey, there's a brochure on our website that actually shows all 73 factors, and you can see the ones that were motivators, and you can see the ones that were deterrents. So bike theft is definitely an issue, but it wasn't the strong deterrent that route design. And I mean, route design was also very strongly positive when it was a good design, and bad route design was a very strong deterrent. So it's the major factor.
Right.
Well, one of the pieces we haven't really talked about today is cycling education. So HASTE has some great statistics from the UK around how transportation numbers by cycling have increased when people feel more confident on their bikes via some of the cycling education they do in the UK. So there's that whole other element, is not just are they feeling safe on the road because of the infrastructure, but do they feel confident in their own abilities as a cyclist to navigate that.
Good point, yeah. Just wondering, Janet, can you speak to what some of those smaller communities that you've worked with found were good solutions in a more rural context?
Well, I don't know all of the details of all of the small community, and that many of them went to cycling infrastructure, and many of them went to creating separated bike lanes. So that definitely was a theme across all of the ones that I was aware of. Trying to access funds was huge for them, for sure. Many of them were able to access more local grants, but really it was about trying to get more matched funding from federal and provincial government.
And here's a good question from Lan. Copenhagen has boldly announced that they will turn into a no-car city by 2050. Do you think it's something that Canada could also do, or one of our major cities, perhaps not in the near future, but anything in that direction that you see?
I definitely think it is possible. I mean, we've really, in North America, almost prevented cycling by the way we've built our cities for cars. And, you know, people generally, when they cycle, they express that they love it. It's fun, it's freeing. Yeah, people are happy when they cycle. So I think there's a lot of pent-up demand. And it's interesting that it's not just Copenhagen, which is already a high cycling city, but that's talking about having no car. Also Oslo in Norway, the center of Paris. There, you know, cities around the world are really looking at active transportation as a wonderful way to make their cities more livable. And it's also a great way to make sure that everyone in society can get around, because although adults in the, you know, from the sort of early 20s to late 60s mainly have access to cars and can drive, there are still people who don't have driver's license, many people with disabilities, older people, younger people, they just don't have access to cars, and it's like we've made it not possible for them to get around, certainly not as easily as people who do, and it's a bit, well, there's a big equity issue there too.
Right. Well, just coming back to the discussion we had about education on cycling, Leo had asked us to mention both the Women on Wheels workshops, if any of you are familiar with that, and also in Victoria, the Greater Victoria Cycling Coalition hub that apparently has good programs. So I assume there's probably others like that that you may be familiar with.
Interesting. It's Angus here. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, I guess not. Okay. Yeah. The topic of education on cycling is interesting because it reminds me of a study we did back in 2008 with Deb Holbrook back in Health Canada on active living. And that study, one of the things we found was that people who are new to cycling or haven't cycled for a long time greatly overestimate the amount of time it takes to get anywhere. So, you know, someone who cycles a little bit might think, well, this is about 10 minutes, 15 minutes to get somewhere, whereas someone who never cycles will think it's an hour and 20 minutes. Like they have no sense of how long it takes. So it's the whole, yeah, and there's a huge sense that if I start to cycle, I have to have, at least in our study back then, people were really intimidated by the spandex, you know, stuff that kind of made them feel like I had to be like a snowboarder or an athlete as opposed to.
Right, yeah. Gurleen, I think this would be a question for you, Kay. What about air pollution? Is that a deterrent, and how do we deal with it if it is?
It's interesting. I don't have it as a deterrent, but we had a question, or one of the potential motivators and deterrents was the route is away from traffic noise and air pollution. And that was our strongest cycling motivator. So being away, I mean, of course, there's three things in there, traffic and traffic noise and traffic air pollution. So being away from that was a huge motivator. And there have been studies showing that riding along busy streets exposes cyclists to more air pollution than riding on residential streets, and even riding on a separated bike path that's a little bit further away from the traffic on a busy street than riding right in the traffic on a busy street actually decreases your exposure to air pollution. There have also been risk-benefit studies trying to assess whether the exposure of cyclists to air pollution reduces the benefits of cycling from the physical activity. And in the kinds of situations we have in North America and Europe, the air pollution is not nearly high enough to overcome the great health benefits of cycling, even if you're cycling on the worst polluted traffic streets. So although air pollution is a negative, it's on busy streets, it's a small negative in comparison to the physical activity benefits.
I guess one of the issues, again, I think, Janet, to you, is that a number of cities where they're talking about putting dedicated bike lanes or in commercial areas, there's always a lot of pushback from the commercial stores in that area saying how if you take away the parking, it's going to have a detrimental impact on their businesses. And I'm wondering if there's been any work done in that area, any research, anything that could help planners in counteracting those arguments.
You know, I don't have access to that, but I literally was just at Car Free Day on the drive, and I know the commercial drive in particular in Vancouver is one of those areas where that is a conversation that is currently going on. I think that the research would support that you would actually get more traffic because people would feel more comfortable to be in that area. They would ride, they would come with their families. I don't have the data, but I could certainly access it.
That would be great. Angus, do you have anything on that at all?
No.
Certainly a current topic. Oh, and Leo is saying that actually Victoria has a great report on bike and economics. So Leo, if you can send that to us, that would be great.
I do have some numbers on the education piece in the UK. So in the UK, they run a cycling education program called Bikeability. So over a 4-year period, they experienced, so it was a cycling education program for kids, they experienced a 100% increase in 11 to 15-year-olds cycling to high school if they had taken a Bikeability course in elementary school.
Yeah, great. And Sandra has mentioned that wayfinding also is very important, the signage that shows safest direction and the time it takes to get to a destination. So is that something that planners need to be thinking about as well? Lan has another comment. Sorry, where is his? Oh, okay. Oh, I see we're just about out of time. So I know there's some other comments and questions, and we'll certainly post those. But I'd like to take this chance to thank our panelists. You've just been terrific, Angus and Kay and Janet. We've really learned a lot today about health and the built environment and cycling, and I hope that all those who've been listening in have as well. I'd also like to thank the Real Estate Foundation for partnering with us on the webinar today. It's thanks everyone in the audience for your attention and interest and questions. We're so glad you could join us. We're going to be following up with a short survey, so I hope that you'll respond, as that helps us to learn from these events and what's working and what we can do better next time. We'll also be continuing with our webinar series. We'll be doing another one in the fall, so please watch your inbox for that, and we hope you'll join us again. But for now, enjoy the rest of the day. Have a great summer. Be active and stay healthy. Thanks so much.